Tonight we're going to talk about subtracting negative integers. Last night we did subtracting positive integers. Now we're going to work some with subtracting negative integers. Here's our objective. I can understand that subtracting a number is the same as adding its opposite through the use of number lines. So I just want to talk for just a minute. Last night we did questions like this, 6 minus 9. I want to remind you, last night when you subtract a positive, you move left on the number line, and that makes sense. Like if you had, 14 or 15 minus 2. 15 minus 2, you start at 15, 2 to the left would be 13, 15 minus 2 is 13. It makes sense when you're subtracting a positive, you're going to move left on the number line. Therefore, when you subtract a negative, instead of moving left, you'll have to move right on the number line. And so that's the big difference tonight. Last night when we were subtracting a positive, we knew we had to move left on the number line. Today when we subtract a negative, we're going to be moving right on the number line, because the opposite of subtracting a positive would be subtracting a negative. So we have to move the opposite way on the number line. Let's look at the following example using vectors and a number line. So 2 plus a positive 5. We remember on a number line, when we're adding a positive, we would be moving to the right to add a positive. So that would be 7. 2 plus 5 is 7. Now we're going to use vectors on a number line to find the solution to 2 minus a negative 5. All right, let's take a look. So first of all, we start with 2. And then we're going to subtract a negative. You remember from last night when we subtracted a positive, we moved left. So subtracting a negative, we actually have to take this and move to the right. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 units. And we actually have to end up again at positive 7. So 2 plus 5, because when we add a positive, we move to the right. Guess what? When we subtract a negative, we also must move to the right. So therefore that answer will also be 7. And that's the connection we're going to be looking for tonight. All right, we used vectors on a number line to find the solution to that expression. So we did 2, and then subtracting a negative. We know when we subtract a negative on the number line, we have to move right. Because to subtract a positive, we moved left. Therefore, subtract a negative, we need to go opposite of that. So we're going to have to move to the right. So that's the example we've been working on all night. Let's make sure you're noticing something. Notice when we subtract a negative, we move to the right on the number line. Does this look similar to the previous problem where we did 2 plus a positive 5? What we need you to notice is subtracting a negative is the same as adding a positive. And that's what we're going to start working with now that we have subtraction going on. Subtracting a negative, same as adding a positive. So 2 minus a negative 5 is the same as 2 plus a positive 5. Let's look at some examples together before we move on. Let's practice with this. 3 minus a negative 2. Well, you might want to fall back on remembering 3 minus a positive 2. When we subtracted a positive last night, we moved left. So now when we subtract a negative, we have to go opposite of that. So when we are subtracting a negative, instead of moving left, we need to move to the right, and that's important. So we start at 0 and we go to 3. Oops. Start at 0 and we go to 3. And then we want to subtract a negative 2. Well, to subtract a negative, we have to move to the right. So then we're going to move to the right 2 more. And where do we actually end up on the number line? We end up at 5. And you see that that's different than 3 minus 2. If we started with 3 minus 2, again, we would move 3 to the right. But then, subtracting a positive, we would have moved back 2, and we would have ended up at 1. So it's just really important that you get clear in your mind that on a number line, it makes sense when we know 3 minus 2 is 1. You have $3, you take 2 away, you have 1 left. So you know when you're subtracting a positive, you're moving left. Subtracting a negative, you must do opposite of that. So I'm trying to stress that you're going to move right. Well, actually, subtracting a negative would be the same as adding a positive. So 3 minus 2 would be the same as 3 plus a positive 2. What's 3 plus 2? That's 5. So I need you to see that there's a connection between 3 minus a negative 2 and 3 plus 2. If we used our rules for addition, signs are the same. We found the sum. Let's do another one. 4 minus a negative 1. Well, you go over to 4. Then keep in mind we're subtracting a negative. If you were subtracting a positive, you would have moved left. So if we're subtracting a negative, we know we need to move to the right. How many to the right? 1 to the right. So 4 minus a negative 1 actually ends up at a positive 5. I just want to make sure. 4 minus a negative 1 can't be the same as 4 minus 1. Well, 4 minus 1, you'd move 4 to the right. Subtracting a positive, we would have to move to the left. You know, subtracting a positive, you move to the left, so you move 1 to the left. That ends up at 3. So I just want to make sure you remember, when you subtract a positive, you move left. Therefore, what's the opposite of that? The opposite of subtracting a positive is subtracting a negative. So when we subtract a negative on the number line, we need to move to the right. And there's another connection I'd like you to make. I'd like you to see when you subtract a negative, we come up with the same answer as if we had added a positive. So instead of subtracting a negative, if you take the opposite operation, you add, and then the opposite of negative 1 is positive 1. If you add a positive, 4 plus 1, signs are the same, find the sum, that's 5. I just want you to be seeing that subtracting a negative is exactly the same as adding a positive. Let's try another one. All right, negative 2 minus a negative 5. On our number line, we start over at negative 2. We go from 0 to negative 2. We're subtracting a negative. When you subtract a negative on the number line, if you are subtracting, when you subtract a negative, that's opposite of what we did last night. So if you subtract a negative, you have to move to the right on a number line. So we're going to subtract a negative 5. From this negative 2, we have to move to the right 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We actually end up at a positive 3. Subtracting a negative on our number line, remember you need to move to the right. You have to do opposite of subtracting a positive. Subtracting a positive, you move left. So therefore the opposite of that, subtracting a negative is the opposite. You're going to have to go in the opposite direction or move to the right. And I just want to look at that expression using our rules for addition. Is subtracting a negative the same as adding a positive? Let's see what negative 2 plus 5 is. Our rules for addition. You're going to circle the sign that goes with the number. You know that's the sign right in front of each number. Then you want to ask yourself, are those signs the same or are those signs different? Signs are different. That one's negative, that one's positive. Signs are different. Find the difference. And we know difference means to subtract. So we just take our larger number 5 minus 2. 5 minus 2 is 3. Then we say, what do we have more of? Well, let's see. We have 2 negatives and we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 positives. We definitely have more positives. Those are going to zero each other out. We actually have 3 extra positives. So that answer is a positive 3. So 2 minus a negative 5 is 3. Negative 2 plus a positive 5 also happens to be 3. So I just want you to try to get a connection between subtracting a negative. That actually turns out to be the same as adding a positive. Rewriting that subtraction statement as addition and taking the opposite of the number being subtracted. All right. At this point, I'll have you pause the video. I'll have you try this one on the number line. Then come on back and let's see how you did. All right, hopefully you paused the video. At this point, hopefully you remember subtracting a negative. When we subtract a negative, we're going to move right on the number line. Got to go opposite of the way we did last night when we subtracted a positive. So we're going to subtract a negative. So you always just, first number tells you where you first have to move to, 0 to -1. Subtracting a -3. So subtracting a negative says we have to move to the right. How many units? 1, 2, 3 units. Where do we end up on our number line? We end up at a +2. So that's going to equal a +2. Now, let's compare that to using our rules for addition. Subtracting a negative. Is subtracting the negative the same as adding a positive? So again, we start with our -1. But now, instead of subtracting a -3, we're going to add a +3 and see if at the end of the day, -1 minus a -3 is actually the same as -1 plus a +3. So we're going to use our rules for integers. For adding integers, we're going to circle the sign that goes with the number, and that's the sign right in front of the number. Are those signs the same, or are those signs different? Well, one of them is a negative, the other is a positive, so the signs are different. You need to find the difference. All right, so to find the difference, I'll take 3 minus 1 is 2. So I know my difference is 2. I ask myself what I have more of. Well, I have 1 negative. I have 1, 2, 3 positives. I definitely have more positives. Negative and a positive are going to zero each other out. How many more positives do I have? I have 2 extra positives. So either way, we come up with a +2. Now I just want to quick discuss the connection between subtracting a negative and adding a positive. I have some nice visuals here for you to try to give you a way to remember. 2 minuses combine to make a plus. Subtracting a negative is the same as adding a positive. Sometimes they say keep, change, change. You keep the first number, you change your subtraction to addition, and you change the sign of the number being subtracted. So 12 minus a -6 is really 12 plus a +6. Hopefully you're seeing subtracting a negative is exactly the same as adding a positive. Try to have a good night. I hope you'll be ready to work some more with that tomorrow in class.